Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome. Greetings from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. And today, the latest in our series of the Virtual Author Series. We will talk to Dale Tafoya, who has written a fascinating new book, came out just last year, about Billy Ball, a phenomenon that I remember quite well back in the early 1980s. The name of the book, Billy Ball, Billy Martin and the Resurrection of the Oakland A's. For those of you who might not know me or forgotten my name, it's all right if you have. I'll just remind you that it's Bruce Markusen. I work in the education department here in Cooperstown, and we're very glad to be with you today for the program. This program, the Virtual Author Series, and all our other virtual programs are made possible through the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. So we do appreciate their support. Without them, we would not be able to do these kinds of programs. We now officially welcome Dale Tafoya to the program, author of Billy Ball, Billy Martin, and the Resurrection of the Oakland A's. Dale, I believe you live in the Bay Area, if I'm not mistaken, and welcome from one coast to the other.
Hey, Bruce, always respected your work on the A's and baseball, and really honored to be here, hosted by the National Baseball Hall of Fame to talk about this incredible story.
Well, we appreciate that very much. It's always fun for me to revisit the topic of the Oakland A's, although I wrote about some earlier A's teams in the early 1970s. Your focus is on some equally fascinating teams in the early 1980s. We also want to remind folks that Dale has written another book as well, Bash Brothers, A Legacy Subpoena. That's a great title. He's also written for a number of well-known outlets, Sports Illustrated, The Athletic, Baseball Digest. Also in our neck of the wood, has written for the New York Post and the New York Daily News. So we're very glad to have Dale with us today. We also want to remind folks that you can purchase the book at our website. Just go to baseballhall.org. That's baseballhall.org. And then at the very top, you'll see a tab where it says Shop. Click on the Shop, and then enter the name Billy Martin in the search box. And the first item that'll come up is Dale's book, and you can reserve your copy and order. It'll be sent to you. So very easy. Just go to the website, baseballhall.org, click on Shop, and then enter Billy Martin to purchase Dale's book. Dale, as we look back at this time period and this subject matter, this is a question I ask many authors, almost all authors, and I think it's a very good starting point. It's why I always ask it. And that has to do with why this particular topic at this time. I know that you're in the Bay Area, but Billy Martin, that was an era from a number of years ago. I certainly remember it. You certainly remember it. Maybe we're a little bit older than some of the viewers and listeners. But why at this particular time did you decide that you really wanted to venture into this topic?
Great question, Bruce. And I've written several book proposals, although I have 2 books under my belt. I don't really write a book proposal unless it grabs me. And this story grabbed me. I was 10 years old when Billy Martin was here in the Bay Area. And I remember how there was just Billy Ball posters all over the Bay Area. He was the face of Oakland A's baseball. And I was just doing some diving into the bowels of history. To write books, you have to do a lot of research in newspaper archives and the microfilm in some libraries to get the content to bring back an era. And as I was reviewing the Billy Ball era, I noticed in 1979, Finley's last year, second to last year owning the A's drew less than 307,000 fans in 1979. They lost 108 baseball games, and they were really a baseball crisis. But by 1982, by the time Billy left the A's had broke the all-time franchise season attendance record with over 1.7 million fans. So we're going from 1979 to 306,763 season attendance to 1982, 1.7 million, and the A's were staying in Oakland. I was just really fascinated with those 3 years. And in my research, Billy Martin was the difference maker of this baseball revival in Oakland. And I say Oakland because the baseball revival had just as much to do with the city than the Oakland A's franchise.
It's interesting, Dale, you mentioned 307,000 fans in 1979. It almost sounds like what they might be talking about this year with limited capacity at ballparks, 20% capacity or 10% capacity. That was at full capacity. They could have as many fans as they wanted, and yet they only drew 300 plus thousand over an 81 game schedule back in 1979. It does show you how dire the situation was for Oakland. Here we have Charlie Finley on the left and, of course, Billy Martin on the right. It's hard to think of two more volatile personalities from the 1970s going into the 1980s than Finley and Billy Martin. And in retrospect, isn't it all surprising to you that a volatile man like Finley would hire an equally volatile man like Billy Martin?
I completely agree. And it's interesting that Billy Martin was on Charlie Finley's radar since the 60s to become the A's manager. Even when Billy Martin was the third base coach for the Twins in the late 60s, he knew that Charlie Finley was going to bring his franchise from Kansas City to Oakland. And Finley flirted with bringing Billy on as manager in 1968, but it didn't materialize. Instead, Finley hired Bob Kennedy. So it wasn't until 1980 that Finley was able to hire Billy Martin from the unemployment line. And in reality, too, is Billy Martin was supposed to manage the 1980 Yankees, not the 1980 A's. But in October of 1979, Bruce, Billy got into a skirmish in Minnesota with a marshmallow salesman, and Steinbrenner fired Billy, and that's where Finley's last manager, Billy Martin. Finley was able to hire Billy, and Billy made the A's worth a commodity worth buying. And by August of 1980, Walter Haas Jr. purchased the A's and solidified their stay in Oakland.
In doing research on this topic, Dale, was there any hesitancy on Billy Martin's part, knowing how much Charlie Finley liked to interfere in the operations of the team?
I don't think so, because Billy knew the crisis the Oakland A's were. Baseball owners wanted to get the A's out of Oakland. Lee McPhail wanted to get the A's out of Oakland. American League clubs were losing money traveling to Oakland because there was just no fans. On April 17th, 1979, Bruce, I'm sure you know this, only 653 fans showed up to a game at the Coliseum. And they say that was a generous estimate when they announced the crowd. Yeah. Billy Martin, Bruce, make no mistake, knew what was at stake when he took that A's managerial job in 1980. Billy Martin was a loyal American League guy, and he wanted to keep that franchise in his hometown. And it turned out to be just a brilliant hiring by Finley. And through it all, Bruce, in the end, Finley was the ringmaster. Finley was the architect of Billy Ball because he hired Billy Martin.
Yeah. In the book, you write about Martin actually trying to bring Mickey Mantle with him as a coach to Oakland. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, Billy, as we know, loyalty was very important to Billy Martin, and he had his cronies and his friends, and he'd bring them like Art Fowler, his pitching coach, and Clete Boyer and Lee Walls. He would bring these coaches, friends, maybe drinking buddies too, with him to every stop. And he offered Mickey Mantle to be the hitting coach of the A's. Not too many know that, but Mickey Mantle was, I believe he was he had a successful insurance company somewhere, and he declined the offer. But when Oakland officials pronounced Billy Martin Day in October of 1980, Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, and a lot of those old Yankees, Billy's old teammates, came to honor Billy, what he was doing, the incredible job he was doing with the A's, putting them back on the map. And as you remember, Bruce, Billy Martin was the manager of the 1972 Tigers when they faced the A's in the 1972 World Series. So they all know about his ties to the Bay Area, and Billy Martin wanted to come And Billy Martin saw the Findlay swinging A's, and he wanted that team to rise again and bring back the fans when he came back to his hometown in 1980 to manage the A's.
During that ALCS against the Tigers, I remember how furious Billy was, and rightly so, after Bert Campaneris twirled his bat in the direction of Laren LeGros. He was not very happy with the A's organization or with Campaneris at that point in time. And then here we have, just less than a decade later, Billy would actually join the A's franchise. It's pretty remarkable the immediate impact that Martin had. The team was awful in 1979, but it's not like they went through a rebuilding phase in 1980. The team was 83 and 79 and a very competitive team in 1980. How did Martin turn it around so quickly?
Well, Billy Martin was a doctor for sick teams. He was 4 for 4 before coming to Oakland in 1980 in terms of turning around bad teams. And it started in 1968, Bruce, when he managed the Denver Bears. He turned that club around. Then in 1969, he managed the Twins and absolutely resurrected that team. And they won the first ever AL West division title, the Twins. And of course, Billy didn't have a long shelf life with every team. And then he went to resurrect the Detroit Tigers. And of course, we talked about them playing the A's and the mighty A's in the 1972 World Series. And then, Bruce, in 1973, Bob Short, who the owner of the Washington Senators, just moved that Washington Senator team to Texas and named them the Texas Rangers. In 72 and 73, the Texas Rangers drew less than 600,000 those 2 years until Billy Martin got there. And then in 1974, just like he did in Oakland, he engineered the Billy's turnaround gang. And he brought just a revival to Texas and saved that franchise and put a lot of players on the map. Ferguson Jenkins should have been, he was next to Catfish Hunter in terms of the Cy Young voting in 1974. He was comeback player of the year. Jeff Burrows was MVP. Mike Hargrove was the rookie of the year. And then after that, Billy goes on to manage the Yankees and resurrects that team. So before he inherited this troubled, sick franchise in 1980, Billy Martin was 4 for 4 in resurrecting teams. And this is not in the stats for managers, but Billy Martin saved franchises in cities. I mean, you can hear about a manager getting a World Series ring. Are there any rings for managers who save franchises in cities like he did in Oakland and Texas?
Yeah. 1981, the second year Billy's in Oakland, the team advances to the American League Championship Series. And they did it with an infield of Jim Spencer, who had been a good player but was now at the end of the line. A guy named Shooty Babbitt playing second base, his only major league campaign. Rob Piccolo was a utility infielder, was the starting shortstop. And then there was a journeyman named Wayne Gross at third base. Now, no insult to these guys because they're all legitimate major leaguers, but that's not exactly the championship level infield that you would typically have for a team that gets to the ALCS. And then you have a bullpen headlined by, really kind of a middle reliever for most of his career, a right-hand pitcher named Jeff Jones. It is remarkable what Billy Martin did with these teams in 80 and 81. Basically, they had great outfields, great starting pitching, and almost nothing else.
Yeah, Billy Martin was like a sorcerer. He was a magician. They called him a miracle worker. I mean, the A's lost 108 games in 79. Suddenly, and this baseball revival comes out of nowhere. And as we talked about in 1980, they're in second place. But what Billy did to this young A's team, the Ricky Hendersons, the Mike Norrises, the Dwayne Murphys, the Wayne Grosses, he made these young kids believe. Billy Martin, he studied a lot of psychology books. He studied it and he learned about how to motivate each player. He hypnotized these young players that lost 108 games, that were used to playing in front of 1,000 fans. He hypnotized them into believing they could win. And it's not that easy. And again, he did the same thing in Minnesota, Detroit, Texas with the Yankees. And after he left Oakland, he was 5 for 5 in changing the culture of a team around. And as Bill James points out in his 1982 baseball abstract, Billy Martin brings this emotionally charged atmosphere to a team, but the shelf life is not long because players, they can't sustain working under that emotionally charged atmosphere for a long time. That's why owners never brought Billy Martin in to rebuild. They brought him in to win right away. And when Billy got there, he poured his soul into winning immediately. And if you look at the first year after he managed a team, that always pop in that second year.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an approach that certainly worked on a 1 or sometimes a 2-year basis, but in terms of long-term success, that was something that did elude Billy Martin for much of his career. Dale, you mentioned Rickey Henderson, future Hall of Famer, and even though he had still not hit the peak of his career, was quickly emerging as the A's best player in the early 1980s. It's a fascinating relationship between these two players who would continue later with the New York Yankees. It always seemed that Rickey Henderson played his best, prospered under Martin. And I'm curious why that happened, because sometimes in other cities, other situations, Billy clashed with a star player. We saw that with Billy and Reggie in New York. What was it about the Billy-Rickey relationship that made it work, where some of his other relationships with superstars simply did not?
Yeah, great question, Bruce. And I think that Rickey realized that Billy made him the player who he can be, the star. Although in 1979, under Jim Marshall, Rickey Henderson was called up from the minors, and he created a spark, and he sparked that 1979 club a little bit. Even though they still lost 108 games. Billy Martin taught Rickey right away to be aggressive on the bases. And look at Rickey's first year, he steals 100 bases for Billy. In 81, Tim Raines wins the stolen base crown. But here, look at Rickey does it in 1982. He swipes 130 bases. And Billy Martin created this culture that Rickey Henderson thrived on. And it was no competition. It was Billy ball, and Billy Martin, a manager, not a player, was the face of this movement. But to this day, Rickey Henderson is still loyal to Billy Martin because Billy Martin, they were both hometown Bay Area guys too. Mm-hmm. Rickey Henderson went to Oakland Technical High School. Billy Martin went to Berkeley High. So it was really a homecoming for Billy Martin and Rickey. But I think we have to remember too, Billy Martin was the first proven really legitimate winning manager the A's had in years in the 70s. After Jim Marshall and the A's players, they sensed that confidence that Billy brought to that team in 1980. And that's kind of how the relationship with Rickey and Billy budded in. Like I said, to this day, Rickey Henderson is still loyal to Billy Martin.
Were there any initial problems between the two of them? You know, Rickey was a very young player. Coming up, Billy was a very old school guy. We know that, they did develop this great relationship. But was it great from the start, or was there a learning curve there?
Well, I think it was great from the start. 1982, Bruce, was just a horrific year. It was rough. And one thing about Billy is he was a hard loser. He was a rough loser, and sometimes when you're losing, players wouldn't really want to be around him. And in 1982, he lost a lot of players because the team was losing, and he wanted to go back to New York. So I'm thinking in 1982 there could have been some strain. I know Rickey Henderson was a little upset at Billy because Billy Martin benched Dwayne Murphy for missing a fly ball during a game, and a lot of the Billy kind of lost a lot of the players in the clubhouse after that. As far as I know, they to this day, Rickey Henderson has a lot of loyalty to Billy Martin.
Really an interesting relationship between the two. We use this term Billy ball, and obviously you know what it means, and I remember seeing it, so I know what it means. But we have some younger viewers, younger participants. They may not know exactly what Billy ball is. What was the style of play? How did the A's approach the game, particularly in 80 and 81?
Well, yeah, Billy, he had this mentality, this aggressive he wanted his players to be aggressive on the base pass. Of course, you had the complete games with the 94 complete games in 1980. He wanted his players to be aggressive, and he instilled the confidence in them. And that spring training in 1980, you got to understand too, Billy Martin was hired a day before pitchers and catchers were scheduled to report. That's like today. Pitchers and catchers are scheduled to report tomorrow. He was hired a day before that, and he immediately injected that confidence and stressed stealing home. And in one of the games in March, Jim Essien, the slowest player on the team, he said, Billy told me anybody could steal home. So the slowest runner on the team broke for home during a game. He stole it. And everybody in the dugout during a spring training game jumped on Jim Essien. And in the press box, after they were celebrating Jim Essien stealing home, because Billy Martin emphasized it, was Ralph Wiley, the great writer from the Oakland Tribune, legendary writer that passed away, I believe, in 2004. He said, this is Billy Ball. And he wrote an article in the March 23rd, 1980 in the Oakland Tribune. It was a column, and that's where he first wrote Billy Ball. There was Billy Ball in the late 70s with the Yankees, but Ralph Wiley was describing the Oakland A's new version of Billy Ball.
That's interesting. I did not know that Wiley came up with that. I thought it was something that the A's, maybe their marketing, well, if they haven't even had a marketing department under Charlie Finley, I thought it was maybe something that came from the A's, but Wiley was the first one to use that term. Interesting.
Yeah, and then the following year, the A's built their marketing campaign on Billy Martin and called it Billy Ball under the marketing prowess of Andy Dolich.
Interesting. Here's another photo from the book. Billy Martin with one of his pitchers, Matt KEOUGH, sadly passed away rather suddenly last year. Did you ever have a chance to talk to KEOUGH about being one of those starters for Billy Martin?
I tried to contact him. I just couldn't locate him. And I did a lot of footwork to contact people, and I was able to contact a lot of players, but he was not one of them. But he epitomized Billy Ball and the resurrection of the A's. Matt KEOUGH, Bruce, was 2-17 in 1979. 2 wins, 17 losses. In 1980, he wins Comeback Player of the Year playing for Billy Martin. Billy Martin just had a way of hypnotizing these players into believing they were superstars and win. And KEOUGH was a perfect example of that.
The other members of that rotation all pitched a ton of innings, just like KEOUGH did. You had Rick Langford, who in some ways was the ace of the staff. You had Mike Norris, who had tremendous talent, had some good seasons, but did kind of flame out. You also had Steve McCatty. Brian Kingman was another pitcher that was part of that. And I know you did have a chance to talk to some of those guys for the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about the complete games. And yes, it was extreme, but the A's bullpen was awful. I mean, Billy Martin did not have a lot to use in that bullpen. Bob Lacey led the A's in 1980 with saves. He had 6 saves. That was the leader in saves. So Billy had no choice but to use these pitchers to complete games. And talking to these players, they loved it. They wouldn't do anything different. These pitchers were used to playing in front of 1,000 fans. Suddenly, they're pitching all these complete games. They're winning. They're on the cover of Sports Illustrated. These stars, Norris, KEOUGH, McCatty, Langford, Kingman, they're all over the media because of these complete games and because what Billy Martin was doing. So that's what made the story great. Yes, their arms were hurt at the end, but they did not want to. They battled Billy to stay on that mound because they knew they didn't know when they were going to get just an opportunity to shine like this. So yeah, it was just great to see what was going on, and a lot of these pitchers to this day are still loyal to Billy Martin, and they wouldn't do anything different. They don't regret pitching all those innings.
That's interesting because none of them had long-term success. Billy took a lot of blame in the mid to late 80s because all of these guys pretty much flamed out after a few years. So none of them were critical of Billy for maybe not taking care of their arms a little bit better?
Not really. I think that again, in real time, This is back in 1980, 81. That was the feeling. Of course, looking back, they could say, I was never the pitcher after that. But during that time, they were riding the momentum. They were riding the momentum of Billy Ball. 1981, the A's broke the record for the fastest start in baseball, 11-0. I believe they were 20-3. Billy Martin was on the front cover of Time magazine. All 5 starters were on the front cover of Sports Illustrated. They did not want to let that spotlight go.
One of the passages that really took me in the book, Dale, was when you talked to Mike Norris, and he compared the previous manager, Jim Marshall, to Billy Martin. And Mike Norris came flat out and told you, he said, Jim Marshall, he did not feel was a qualified major league manager. The players did not respect him. He was maybe too old school in his approach. And then, of course, contrasting that to Billy Martin, whom he seemed to love. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I think, and Mike Norris, extremely loyal to Billy Martin to this day. And when you talk about the 1979 A's, Bruce, aside from the 108 losses and the less than 307,000 attendance, the 1970 A's lacked discipline. An outfielder, Miguel De Leon, he went after Jim Marshall in the dugout with a bat. Glenn Burke abandoned the team in June of 1979. He just quit baseball. We had just the A's were rock bottom, and there were players on the A's that faked injuries just so they didn't have to go on road trips with this team. So the 1979 A's really lacked leadership. And I hear Jim Marshall, just a wonderful person, but they needed discipline. And that's what Billy Martin also brought. Not that he was the most disciplined person, but he brought that confidence and that discipline to the A's. And suddenly the A's were the players were forced to wear suit and ties on airplanes. And when they were traveling, they had to wear a sports coat with an A's logo when they were traveling. And he really raised the bar of professionalism when he arrived.
So Billy's pitchers remain supportive of him to this day. How about any of the other players? Were there any players that you interviewed that were highly critical of Martin, or simply flat out refused to talk because maybe they didn't have anything good to say about Billy? Did you run into that at all?
Well, I think that I'm sure there were some players that weren't fans of Billy, and they didn't talk to me. They didn't want to interview. So you have some of those who I'll never get to them because they don't want to talk about it. And you have a pitcher like Bob Lacey. Him and Billy Martin had some notorious clashes in 1980, but Bob Lacey spoke to me, and he got where I was coming from. He got the book, and he had a copy of the book, and he said he was right on. And you have some players, and even Brian Kingman. Brian Kingman had a notorious fight clash with Billy Martin in a bar in Kansas City. And he spoke to me about that as well. So you have some players that maybe didn't like Billy, but 40 years later, maybe their things got things in perspective. Maybe they were less angry, and they wanted to participate and be a part of the book and kind of share their side of the story too.
You mentioned Bob Lacey, and it always brings to mind a story with him. And it's really not a Billy Martin story, but it's worth mentioning. One year, Lacey was getting ready to drive to spring training out in Arizona, and he would drive out, not fly out. It's a long trip cross country. And apparently during that winter, he had gotten a little bit overweight, put on a few pounds, and he knew that he was going to get a hard time. This might have been the late 70s. I don't remember who the manager was. So he decided, as he was driving to the A's spring training site in Arizona, he turned the heat up in the car as high as it would go. And I think he wore maybe a sweater and a jacket. And he basically tried to sweat the pounds off as he was driving in the car cross country to Arizona. By the time that he had arrived in Arizona, he had practically put himself in a position of suffering from heat stroke. Thankfully, wow. It wasn't quite that serious, but he did become rather ill. And he got some heat from the other players for that rather strange method of trying to lose weight. Just thought I'd mention that about
Fun
Bob
story.
Lacey,
Thanks.
bring him up. He was a left-hander with some talent, a little bit wild, and had a few good moments in the major leagues, but really kind of did not have the long-term success that the A's had hoped that he would.
And
So
Bruce,
most of the players
Bob Lacey was also the A's pitched 94 complete games in 1980. He pitched number 94 as a reliever, kind of oddly, I think the last week of the season. Some people think that all the starters pitched the 94 complete games. Bob Lacey pitched number 94, a reliever.
Interesting. Dale, you talked to a number of the beat writers in the Bay Area who covered Martin on a day-to-day basis. Now, to be honest, Billy had a reputation for being difficult with at least some media members. There were some guys that he did not trust. That especially occurred during his years in New York with the Yankees. What did the beat writers in Oakland say about Billy? Did they have a lot of problems the way that Billy ran things?
I think that talking to a lot of the beat writers, I mean, they respected what he did, and really the revival that Billy Martin brought to Oakland, the writers benefited from it. They were, these local writers were finally able to cover some good baseball. I mean, these writers were covering games with 300, 400 fans, 500 fans. Now, all of a sudden, one writer told me during the height of Billy Ball, these writers from New York were starting to come to Oakland to cover the A's when Billy Martin was leading the charge. So I think Billy Martin just brought a lot of excitement, and he made it fun for the beat writers. And a lot of the beat writers I've talked to, they really said some good things about Billy, and they respected him as a manager. In 82, things kind of went south, and they shared some of their thoughts about that. But Billy Martin made exciting for everybody, including the writers covering the A's.
Do you think it was a case of being in a smaller market than New York? Billy was more relaxed. This was his hometown. Do you think that made for a better relationship?
Oh, absolutely. Billy was home. It was his hometown. Billy, he was born in Berkeley, went to Berkeley High. Billy, like I said, this is an Oakland story because Billy played for Casey Stengel with the Oakland Oaks in the late 40s, and he led the Oakland Oaks to their first Pacific League title since 1927. And this is post-World War II, post-Depression, and Billy Martin creates this civic revival in Oakland. And then here, 32 years later, he comes and manages the A's again and triggers another baseball revival in Oakland and does some great things. So I think Billy was more relaxed. He was very stressed out in the last 2 or 3 years in New York. He comes home. He gets to live near his mother, Joan Downey. She still lived in the Victorian home in Berkeley. He started getting color on his face. He started to gain weight. Billy Martin absolutely loved being home, and he needed to be home. And again, when he came to manage the A's, he knew what was at stake. He knew the A's were a sick franchise, and he wanted to keep that American League club in his hometown, and he did.
You mentioned Joan Downey. She's a character. You explore her in the book. Tell us about her.
Yeah, that's Billy Martin's mom, and she, like Dave Newhouse, a great columnist for years for the Oakland Tribune. He said, when I interviewed Billy Martin, it felt like I was talking to his mother. When I interviewed his mother, it felt like I was talking to Billy Martin. And this was a woman that just would curse. She was a fighter. She would fight you. She would curse at you. And it's interesting that Billy Martin, his December 25th crash, his death in 1989, only I think about 10 days before his mother passed away. So he was very close with his mother. He loved his mother. He was loyal to his mother. His mother taught him how to stand up for himself and be tough. And he died a week, 2 weeks later after she died in 89. I think that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, she had a reputation for being very feisty, colorful with the language, to say the least.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Talked to a lot of reporters. They interviewed her and especially some TV people, and they had to mute and and put all kinds of different noises over the swear words she would spit out. So yeah. It, just like Billy Martin, feisty, fought all her life to get where she was, and that's exactly what was Billy Martin's mentality.
As I recall, she had a very difficult time after she became pregnant with Billy. Her husband either left her or something occurred there relatively quickly. So she basically had to raise Billy on her own, correct?
Yeah. She, her husband left her, and she bashed his car windshield with a bat. Not surprising. And she had something. She knew his Alfred was her husband's name. That was Billy's dad. And she just didn't like him. I think she even said she would spit on his grave. So it was just rejection she was having problems dealing with. And I think Billy Martin's dad, Alfred, passed away in the middle of the 1981 season in Alameda, California, while Billy was manager of the A's. I really don't think they had a good relationship toward the end.
And of course, that was Billy's actual name. Nobody called him that, but
right.
His, as I recall, his actual name, Alfred Manuel Martin.
Right.
But he was always known as Billy, both as a player and as a manager. We will take your questions for Dale about the topic of Billy Martin, Billy Ball, the Oakland A's of the early 1980s. And you can pose those questions in our chat room. In fact, some folks have already chimed in. We have a question from Paul Kelly. He asks, Dale, any stories of the A's Yankees 1981 playoff series?
There was a story when the Yankees swept the A's in the ALCS. If you remember, Bruce, that was a strike year. And they had the ALCS, and the Yankees beat them. Dave Righetti beat the A's Game 3 under the twilight. And after the game, I think you hear the notorious fight in an Oakland bar between Reggie Jackson and I believe Greg Nettles. They started to fight, and Reggie Jackson brought some friends after that. So I think that the A's lost, and it was just a tough. It was a tough time. But even when the A's lost, you kind of had a feeling that the A's were starting to build again. Even though they lost, they still won the AL West. You had a chance that they were still on the verge of doing something great. But also during that season, the series, you could remember at Yankee Stadium, I believe it was game 1 or 2, that fireworks start to go off in that upper deck. And then the fans started to throw baseballs at Tony Armas in right field, and it got kind of ugly. So yeah, just kind of some fun times during that 81 the 81 season. And if you remember, the A's drew 1.3 million in 1981. They would have broke the all-time franchise record in 1981 if it weren't for the 22 home dates that were erased by the 1981 strike.
Right. You think back to the A's losing that series, not many people really gave them a chance against the Yankees. They were the more established team. They were the team expected to be there. And even though it was tough losing that series the way that they did, it didn't give A's fans a bad taste. They still had a very positive feeling about that club going into 1982. That did not change that.
Oh, absolutely. The A's were just they were still coming up. They still had Rickey. They still had Dwayne Murphy. They still had Mike Norris. And it was just the A's were still it was year 3 coming in 1982. And I don't know if we're going to talk about 1982 because things kind of go downhill after the 81 season. But yeah, it was just a tremendous baseball renaissance in 1981, and that was the peak of Billy Ball. And with the strike, you had the strike. You had the first place winners in the AL West face the second half winners, and that's where the A's faced the Royals in that mini series, and the winner of that played the Yankees in the ALCS, and as we know, the A's swept them in 3 games, I believe, too, to face the Yankees. So yeah, the 81 was just the pinnacle of Billy Ball at its best.
80 and 81 were both great seasons, but as you mentioned, things completely fell apart during the 1982 season. One of the things that I remember growing up as a New York baseball fan in the 70s and 80s was that whenever Billy Martin came on to manage the team, and he managed the Yankees during 5 different terms, at the beginning, he always looked great. There was the old line from George Steinbrenner: he's tanned, he's rested, he didn't look thin, his face was fuller, he looked healthy, he felt good. Then, usually by the end of his managerial tenure, whether it was his second season, third season, what have you, he looked worn, he looked haggard, he almost looked as if he were ill. The losses took an effect. The relationship with Steinbrenner took an effect. I'm curious, did that happen at all with him in 82? Did you start to see some deterioration in him physically, or was it not as bad because Oakland was not as pressurized an environment as New York?
Well, I don't think it was. I think it was less publicized and not as bad. But here again, this was the third year, and with Billy's shelf life and track record, just like he was a doctor for bad teams, he didn't stay around long. It was that third year he navigated to another team, and Billy, that starting in that 1982 spring training, he was pretty disengaged. He had a trailer in left field that him and his coaches would hang out. He talked to some media. And you got to remember, when the Hosses purchased the A's, they really purchased Billy Ball, because the Hosses, they bought the team because of this revival Billy Martin created. Billy Martin was their guy to run this team, and they gave Billy Martin, Bruce, a lot of power. You know that he was the general manager essentially. So this spring training in 82, this is kind of where it started off kind of rough. Is Billy Martin? He wanted to preach Billy Ball, his style of play, to the entire organization, all 3 levels of the minor league system. So that spring training, him and his coaches, they wanted to see all the prospects, all the players in spring training. So that particular spring training in 1982, you had over 100 players on one field battling, and so you had lines for batting practice that reached the dugout. It was also that spring training in Arizona. It was raining. There was no indoor facilities. So none of the everyday players, the Rickey Hendersons, the Mike Norrises, the Steve McCann, they didn't get any playing time that spring. And that kind of set precedent and set the tone for really just a miserable season in 1982. And although in 1982, the A's broke the franchise record for attendance. They drew over 1.7 million fans. And when I say franchise record, this includes Philadelphia. And but at the same time, in August, Billy Martin tears his office with some coaches. And after that, it was pretty easy to understand that he was going to be headed to the Yankees next, and he would not be returning to the A's as manager. And during the World Series in 1982 is where Roy Eisenhart and the A's announced that they fired Billy Martin.
Interesting. You mentioned he was both manager and general manager of the franchise. That would be unheard of in today's game, where things are so much more specialized. Being a general manager requires so many hours year round that to be a manager and a GM today, virtually impossible to do. You mentioned Eisenhart making the decision to fire Billy. What was the reaction like in Oakland to that? Were people?
Well, I think it's interesting. I'm sorry.
Yeah, were people accepting of it given how bad the season was, or was Billy still so popular that they did not agree with that?
Well, I think, and this is interesting, I think with A's fans, unlike other teams, Minnesota, Detroit, New York, I think that they wanted to keep Billy. An owner really had to be careful. Owners like Calvin Griffith, they really had to be careful when they fired Billy Martin, because the fans will go nuts. They would protest and say, no, you're not letting, because Billy Martin was such a cult figure. He connected with the working class fans so well. But in this sense, in 1982, I think even the fans realized, with that rough year in 1982 and the losses, I think even they realized that it was kind of time for Billy to move on. And then, of course, you have the A's hired Steve Burrows the next year. And that's where kind of computer ball and money ball started the following year, when Steve Burrows, who had a degree in literature, and Roy Eisenhart, Sandy Alderson were very smart as well. They started bringing a lot of intelligence to the A's organization. So, but I think the fans, I think they realized it was time for Billy to go. And look, Billy Martin will always be addicted to the Yankees. He'll always be associated with the Yankees. But this is just a great story of Billy coming home and saving his hometown franchise. And by 1983, Steinbrenner brought him back, and he was the manager of the New York Yankees again.
Dale, it's nearly 40 years later. Billy still well remembered in the Bay Area, or have people forgotten him?
I think that this whole Billy Ball era was fun, and I still remember just the billboards and the fun, the excitement he brought. And I think that this book here brings into context what the situation politically, the mess that he inherited, and his role was a lot more significant in Oakland baseball history than people give him credit for. I mean, you think about Billy, you think of the double steals and the Billy Ball and the marketing campaign, but people really, I don't think they realized until I did the research for this book that he was just a key cog in saving that franchise in Oakland.
Very interesting. We're going to take some questions for Dale. A number have come in through our Zoom group chat room. Let's take one from Mark Salmon. Mark writes, when you visit his grave in New York, there are always bats, balls, notes, etc., even beer bottles as well. These are all at Billy's grave. He was loved by so many. I'll ask a question that maybe Mark was intending to ask Dale. Did you ever go to Billy's gravesite?
No, I haven't. I would love to one day. Met his son, talked to his son, interviewed Billy Martin Jr., great guy for this book. Yeah, but I haven't been able to go to his grave. And whenever I find myself in New York City, that's the East Coast, that's an idea to see his grave.
Yeah,
I passed by his home in Berkeley. I live in the Bay Area. Passed by his home. Passed by James Kenny Park. Actually visited James Kenny Park, where he grew up playing on the sandlots. Berkeley, learned how to play baseball. So that was kind of some historic stuff. But yeah, I didn't see his grave, although that's a great idea.
Yeah, you mentioned Billy Martin Jr., Billy's son. He was very helpful to you. What does he do? What is his employment?
I believe Billy Martin Jr. is an agent. I believe he works. I think he's a part owner of a minor league team too. And it was important for me to get Billy Martin Jr. on board for this too, because at this point, I don't write books just to write books. I want them to have meaning. When I write a book, I don't want anybody I interview to say, hey, I didn't say that. I still want to be able to interview these people for other projects. So if Billy, before I even wrote this book, I talked to Billy Martin Jr. on the phone, and I told him my vision for the book. And if he said, I don't want you to write it, I don't want any part of it, I wouldn't have did it. But he was on board. He remembered when his dad was home in Oakland managing the A's, and he loved when his dad was back home managing the A's because he was healthier. His skin was back. He remembers visiting his dad in the Bay Area, and when he was managing the A's. So Billy Martin Jr. really had some fond memories. I believe he was like 10 or 12 years old when his dad was managing the A's, and so it was really helpful to get him on board, because if he was not on board, I would have not have written this book. I'm not going to write a book and have a family person pissed off at me or anything. I do this because I want it to be a good work of art and have some historical insight. So he was important for me to talk to and get on board for this project.
Based on the timeline you just mentioned, Dale, Billy Martin Jr. was still very young when his father passed away. I mean, that's a traumatic situation to lose your father in a car accident, but essentially when you're still a teenager or maybe just past your teenage years, must have been devastating to Billy the younger.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. And I think by the time Billy passed in 1989, I'm thinking Billy Martin Jr. was maybe 20, 21, 22. Yeah, I'm sure it was devastating. And to this day, Billy Martin has just a lot of great memories of his dad, and and so he really appreciates the people and the writers that endorse his dad. It really respect his dad's legacy, and his dad, writing all the research, doing all the research, and writing a book on Billy Martin. I've come to the conclusion he was definitely a doctor for sick teams, because that's all he did. He resurrected franchise after franchise in every city he went.
One of our viewers asked a question that I always ask theoretically about Billy Martin. If he had not died in that car crash near Binghamton, New York, not too far from here in Cooperstown, would he have returned to manage again? I'm convinced that he would have. I don't think there's much doubt about it. Your thoughts on that? Do you think he would have managed, whether it was the Yankees again or maybe going back to Oakland? Do you think that would have occurred again?
Oh, absolutely. He would have managed the Yankees again. And this is their relationship with George Steinbrenner and Billy Martin. I mean, they couldn't live without each other, and they couldn't live with each other, but they were addicted to each other. Steinbrenner loved Billy Martin. Steinbrenner loved the adrenaline Billy Martin would bring, and that jolt and that life he would bring to the Yankees every time he'd come back. And they just a special relationship. And that's why Billy Martin, I think his number is retired now in New York. And just, again, this book is not to take away what Billy did in New York and his relationship with the Yankees as a cult figure. I mean, New York Yankee fans love Billy Martin. It's just this little 3 years where Billy Martin comes home and saves his hometown franchise, the A's.
There was this strange chemistry between Billy Martin and George Steinbrenner. At times, they were clawing at each other, especially in the midst of a losing streak, in the midst of a pennant race. But then they did have this mutual attraction, and it kind of manifested itself in strange ways. You remember those old Miller Lite commercials,
right,
that Billy and George used to do, and they would poke fun at their relationship about how Billy was being hired again and he was being set up to be fired again. And you could see it even in those 30-second spots. There was just something that clicked between these two guys. I don't know how to put your finger on it, how to characterize it, but there was something there.
Yeah, and Steinbrenner really, he wanted the best for Billy. Even when Charlie Finley hired Billy was still under contract with the Yankees. So Steinbrenner really had to release Billy from the contract to free Billy to sign with Finley in 1980. So yeah, just they had this weird relationship, but they loved each other. They respected each other. Even when Billy really was forced to resign, I believe at the end of the 1978 season, after he said those controversial remarks about Reggie and Steinbrenner, and he was forced to resign, the Yankee fans protested. And they flooded the phone lines at Yankee Stadium, and it really forced Steinbrenner to announce during Old Timers game that Billy Martin would be the manager of the Yankees in 1980.
Right.
And that's, again, owners had to really be careful when they fired Billy, because the fans would turn on the owners, because Billy connected with the working class so much, Bruce. I mean, He was a guy that you wanted in your corner. He was a guy that would fight for you. And they're just an intriguing figure.
I remember that so well. Billy was fired in the middle of the season. Bob Lemon was brought in, and Bob Lemon actually ended up being the perfect choice because he brought a very calm, reasoned approach to a chaotic situation. The Bronx Zoo had gotten completely out of control in the clubhouse, and Lemon was able to straighten that out. But as you mentioned, it was 2 weeks later, the Old Timers Day announcement that Billy would return in 2 years and would manage the New York Yankees. And as it turned out, he actually returned quite a bit sooner than that. We have a question from Paul. Paul was asking, I seem to have lost the question for the moment. Let me try to regain it. My questions are moving around on me here. Paul writes, this was very enjoyable. Wants to know, Dale, what other sports figures have you written about?
Well, my first book I wrote about Jose Canseco and Mark McGuire. It's called Bash Brothers. That came out by Potomac Books. That kind of put me on the map as a baseball author. So I kind of covered the infant stages of the steroid revolution in baseball. So I spent a lot of time studying and doing a lot of research on Jose Canseco and Mark McGwire, the Bash brothers, and it just different players, different stories. But in terms of a book, again, when I write a book and when I write about people in a book, it has to grab me. And Billy Martin was a subject that grabbed me, the whole Billy Ball, and Canseco and McGwire as well on the A's. So those are the players that I wrote. I was intrigued enough to write a book about. So
growing up in the Bay Area, was there a particular athlete that you really idolized? Maybe it was Canseco or McGwire or someone else.
Well, I would say my favorite all-time baseball player is Rickey Henderson. I remember in 1982 when he broke the stolen base record. I was a kid in the Bay Area in front of my TV. He was in Milwaukee and he broke the all-time stolen base record. So that was my first taste of how I first started following the A's, when I saw Rickey Henderson break the all-time stolen base record. So he would probably be my favorite all-time A's player. Rickey.
Not a bad choice. Greatest leadoff man in baseball history, member of the Hall of Fame, also the game's all-time stolen base king. Final question, Dale, before we let you go. As you continue to publicize this book, any thoughts on what might be a future book project for you?
Well, yeah, I have a book proposal that's floating around some publishers. It's on. It's based in Huntsville, Alabama. It's a baseball. I like covering baseball revivals and baseball renaissances in cities. I like how the city is connected with the team and how fans are excited. This is a story about the 1985 Huntsville Stars. It was their first minor league team, I believe, in 40 years. And it just created a revival in Huntsville, the Rocket City. So I'm working on and the Huntsville Stars were the AA farm club of the Oakland A's in that season. So they won the Southern League in their first year of existence, and players like Jose Canseco, Eric Plunk, and Terry Steinbach, they're on that club. So it's kind of a fun baseball revival I'm going to be covering. Hopefully we'll get the numbers right and get the book deal soon cemented.
Was Don Mincher involved with that team?
Absolutely. Don Mincher, former first baseman for the A's, I believe in the early 70s. And I have a whole chapter about Don Mincher. He was Mr. Huntsville Baseball. So really, and he was the president of the Huntsville Stars. He passed away. He passed away maybe 10 years ago, I think. But yeah, he huge influence. And I interviewed Don Mincher on several occasions. Great guy and just a huge influence in that Huntsville area.
You know, the reason I bring up Don Mincher, people have asked me about the book that I wrote about the A's. Who was the best guy that you interviewed for that book? Don Mincher was that guy. I think he was
great guy.
And he was the best. He gave me so much information. And I was very new at writing at that time, very new at doing interviews of any sort. And he was just so helpful to me. He provided not only great stories, but also advice on other players that I should talk to, maybe players I should avoid or be careful. And he was extremely helpful. If that first interview had not gone well, I don't know if the book would have come out. I might have been discouraged. But Don Mincher really encouraged me to keep going with it. So I'm glad to hear that you say that about the late Don Mincher. Dale, this has been a lot of fun. Again, the book is Billy Ball, Billy Martin and the Resurrection of the Oakland A's. You can purchase it at our website. Visit baseballhall.org. Click on the shop tab. It's near the top of the screen. And then from there, just enter the words Billy Martin in the search box. Several items will come up, but the first item that comes up is Dale's book, and you can purchase it right there. Dale, we really appreciate your time. It's been fun. Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot, Bruce. Take care.
So again, our guest, Dale Tafoya, author of Billy Ball, Billy Martin and the Resurrection of the Oakland A's. We thank Dale. We thank all of our viewers and participants, and we also thank our sponsor. This program made possible through the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. Our next program is coming up on Thursday afternoon. And on Thursday, we're going to have a chance to talk to a gentleman named Jeff Urban. He is a longtime employee of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Library and Museum. And he is going to talk to us about FDR's connection to baseball, specifically during World War II, giving Commissioner Landis the green light to keep baseball going. We're going to talk about that subject. We felt it was timely, this being President's Week. So an interesting conversation. Jeff Urban from the FDR Museum and Library, and that'll be coming up on Thursday. It'll be our next virtual program that we will offer to you through the Ford Motor Company. Thanks for being with us, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Take care.